Welcome to my presentation, The Relevance of Cultural Relativism. There's so much regarding this topic. I'm going to scratch the surface barely today, but let's get going. The practice of cultural relativism has always existed, but really the idea became more vocalized with a man named Franz Boas, an anthropologist who introduced the idea that cultural relativism means that you can't objectively rank a society as better or worse than another, higher, more moral, or not, because the entire human race views the world through their own societal and cultural lenses, meaning they also judge the world in front of them according to their own cultural lenses. Though this relativism has always existed, at the end of World War II, mid-1940s onward, you really see the contrast and the conflict between cultural relativism and universalism. You have conventions, tribunals, declarations of human rights that emphasize the Western idea of basic human rights that are universal. But you also see regimes and religious states and authoritarian regimes rise up and say, no, we value our culture more than we value this seemingly Western idea. And so again, you see this conflict and this contrast between these two ideologies. I would personally classify Boasian ideologies or cultural relativism as myopic, as a leading ideology, because in essence it requires that external cultures not only tolerate but really support and maybe even accept the actions of other cultures. This eliminates the opportunity for change. I would argue the only constant in a culture is change. And if we remove the opportunity for change out of that culture, you risk losing or you risk killing a culture that cannot adapt to societal changes, economic and political changes. Aside from that, a lot of times if a culture is collapsing, or cultural relativism requires that people accept that culture. Is it moral to accept principles that would lead to a dying culture for the sake of preserving that culture that's falling anyways? I hope that makes sense. A lot of relativists, as you see here, they don't publicly recognize that a lot of exotic cultures that we strive to preserve, cultural values that we strive to preserve, are also highly accompanied by poverty, by powerlessness, by oppression. And as Ambassador Scheffer has proposed in his lecture material, instead of leaving cultures as they are, allowing them to stay and maintain their state of being as museum pieces, quote unquote, we should help to bring about change that allows societies to adapt and to grow and to nourish and to prosper. Now, one main reason we can't let cultural relativism guide our international policy on human rights is because this ideology dictates that these rights are up for interpretation, while universalism dictates that these rights, marriage, freedom of expression, religion, women's rights, etc., are not up for interpretation. Universalists will fight for most, if not all, of these listed here. I do want to point out, though, that the Western community, the United States specifically, is not purely universalistic. If you look at this guns I put here, if you were to walk around and ask someone in the United States if he or she believes that gun ownership is a basic right, they would tell you probably yes. This is something that most Americans would have a really hard time giving up. And this just shows that we do practice cultural relativism to some degree in the West. Now, I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I just want to say we should offer some empathy to other states who experience difficulty giving up their cultural values as well. Um, I do want to emphasize and focus on two things. First of all, religion, women's rights, and really more specifically combining them, women's rights under religion. I would argue that the most consistent violations of human rights have occurred with women's rights. Now, I want to use Sudan as an example of the greater issue that we see in maybe Africa and the Middle East with women's rights, specifically female genital mutilation. Now, this is a cultural value that has existed for quite some time. If you look, 87% of women in Sudan have undergone female genital mutilation. Statistically, I read that about 200 million women alive today have experienced or undergone female genital mutilation. Like I said, this is a cultural value. A lot of women say they do it because it makes them more pure, it's socially acceptable, there are better marriage prospects, makes them more chaste, attraction increases between partners. These are all justifications for practicing this procedure. Is it morally correct? No. Is it culturally valued? Yes. But I would argue that this is more of an oppressive value that is imposed upon the society. So what is the world doing to combat this? There is this thing called the National Council for Child Welfare, and it's been working with the UN and other international organizations of human rights to implement what they call the National Strategy to Abandon Female Genital Mutilation. And this has been going for quite some time. But as you can see, in 1990, about 80% of women supported this practice. Now 40%, 41% support it. The support is greatly declining, and that is because of education and the work that international organizations and human rights groups have been doing to promote a more universalistic approach to human rights, especially for women. And one last statistic there, 28 out of 54 countries have implemented laws against this mutilation. Iraq and Oman, I believe, are the only countries in the Middle East that have laws against it. And we still have a long way to go. One reason that women and a lot of groups are oppressed in society, I would have to attribute to extremist religious practices. Now, I have to say I'm a very religious person, and I think religion is beautiful. But if we look at some extreme parts of religion, especially under Islam, Sharia law specifically will govern or prevail over human law or policy. Because of the nature of religion, a lot of times it doesn't matter what international laws are imposed. Religion will always dictate an individual's life and a religious state's policy. In Islam, women are disqualified from holding general public office. They wear veils, which can be a beautiful thing culturally, and a lot of women are in support of this, but it can become very oppressive. I want to read what Ambassador Sheffer gave us. Sharia reflects a historically conditioned interpretation of Islamic scriptures in the sense that the founding jurists had to understand those sources in accordance with their own social, economic, and political circumstances. A new understanding would be informed by contemporary social, economic, and political circumstances in the same way that the old understanding on which Sharia jurists acted was informed by the then prevailing circumstances. What does that mean? It means the previous social environment dictated how Sharia law was implemented, which means today a new social and political and economic environment has the capacity to influence a new Sharia law, a new culture, a new way that Islamic and other religious practices are implemented. And we shouldn't shut off change because certain values are ingrained into a religion. Here's a quick example of human rights violations by extremist religious groups. 1.4 million girls in Afghanistan are banned from higher education because of religious views. This has to change. This is outdated. These ideologies are outdated and unjust. I just want to argue that cultural relativism's attempt to preserve culture by fighting human rights is a weak argument, especially in oppressive religious regimes, in part because there's often a lack of consensus on various ideologies within a specific religion itself. This basic concept shows that religions change throughout history, they transform in society, they transform socially themselves throughout time. And this opens the door in the idea that religions can and do and should change and adjust today, especially in regards to their adherence to human rights. There are now no excuses. If you just look at this graph, the difference between Sunnis and Shias is, I mean, there are some pretty drastic differences in how they perceive the world around them and each other, which means they can change the way they perceive very basic human rights as well. And I want to highlight the fact that religion can change. I'm personally a member of the LDS Church, which has its history in social inequality and racism at times. Sometimes religions follow social norms. Sometimes social norms follow religions. That is normal, and that's okay, as long as we don't become stagnant. For example, the LDS Church used to have very passionate beliefs about the roles of men and women in the family and in the home. Those have transitioned throughout time. The Community of Christ Church, a breakoff church of the LDS faith, has recently ordained women to their ecclesiastical positions, what they call the priesthood, and it's been great for them. So there is room for change. With regards to the future, the U.S. has a long way to go. The West has a long way to go. The United States has not ratified several treaties, human rights treaties. If we truly want to allow universalistic approach to take the lead, we have to take the lead in showing that our values truly align with such. A lot has been done and is being done. You can see here, I just listed a few of the things throughout history. The AAA has transitioned and come a long way. They used to be very relativist in their ideologies, but recently, starting in the mid-1990s, they developed a much more universalistic approach, developing a human rights council. Transitions have been slow but sure. You see a lot of international tribunals and courts being implemented and honored, and that is in order to establish that overall in this world we do value human rights and are going to do a lot to promote the adherence to such rights. I could praise the UN over and over again for being the standard for human rights, for being very firm on the ideas that relativist claims on culture do not absolve states from human rights obligations. That tradition, it's invoked to justify the status quo, but shouldn't always justify the status quo. So the UN, I believe, is really the glue and should be our standard as it grows in how it adheres to and promotes human rights. Moving forward, we have to decide when we're faced with the decision to defend culture or promote human rights, we promote human rights. If I were making international policy, I would give myself this test To decide if I should let relativism prevail, number one, is a large population minority group being punished or suffering because of the need to maintain culture? Number two, would a society be dismantled or improved if action were taken against a cultural practice? Is this society widely accepted and popular among government and average citizens? Does this cultural practice promote peace? Has this cultural practice historically benefited or detracted from the well being of a civilization at each social level? Should cultural relativism guide our policies? I don't believe so, especially not in the realm of human rights and in consideration of this litmus test. But there are moments when relativism can be honored, again, not to replace human rights. And while ensuring human rights takes time, there are things that we can do with patience. Number one, language preservation should be a priority. I have visited Guatemala about 14 times in my life, and languages, especially in this example, the Maya languages, they're a connection between people. They maintain culture, they preserve it. They're a connection to the past, to history. Language should be preserved at all costs, and we can focus on this. Number two, international unity. I really think that there must be charters for religious and human rights, religious representatives who participate in decision making, because this really is something we need to find some middle ground on. And we should have religious leaders take part in policy making, very moderate religious leaders, to ensure that we can get somewhere. Number three, education, 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 especially in primary education. We should teach maturation classes, human rights classes. This will ensure that cultural relativism doesn't detract from a society's ability to move forward and grow, but will offer the best a society has. And that brings me to number four, building up the best in cultures. Instead of focusing on what a culture has that is negative or bad or is detracting from human rights, as long as it's not on a major scale, let's build up the best and allow for the weak parts of a culture to die out or to fizzle out throughout time. As we bring out the best, maybe the worst will naturally dissipate. Perhaps one of the greatest obstacles to consistent adherence to basic divine human rights is cultural relativism. So policy that we make must acknowledge and allow space for relativism. It can't always be a bad thing, but it must never take precedence over the assurance of human rights. I'll end with this. I have visited a lot of places, Central America, North America, Eastern and Western Europe. I have never seen a culture that, if we were to focus on human rights and the implementation of such, that would take away from the innate beauty and foundation of that culture. The opposite is true. I am positive that focusing on this universalistic approach will just bring out the best in cultures, will enhance a people, will bring people up instead of down, and will not contribute to the loss of a civilization, a society, a culture. Thanks for listening.